Welcome to Breaking Banks.
Well, as we're about to head into the fourth quarter with so many leaders starting to look hard at plans and budgets, we're continuing our focus on the big picture strategy. And today we're talking about culture and risk taking. So I'm excited to welcome back our good friend, Matteo Rizzi. Matteo is the creator and co-founder of FinTech Stage, a unique conference series which has been bringing together fintech startups, investors, and financial institutions since 2014. He's an investor and was co-founder of InnoTribe at Swift. He's also an executive producer and one of the hosts of Breaking Banks Europe, and he's the author of the book Talent and Rebels, Dealing with Corporate Misfits. Matteo, it feels like we're dealing with more risk right now than any of us planned or maybe are even comfortable with. But maybe living in 2020 is helping us think about risk differently. How should leaders think about risk and risk taking in their organizations as we head into 2021 and beyond?
Hi guys, and thank you, JP, for having me. It's always a pleasure. Risk is of course has different facets, right? And you mentioned the book, of course, which is more the journey of the risk takers in terms of both companies that want to sort of welcome talents that are more prone to certain type of disruptive innovation, and at the same time, I try to protect somehow or comfort, this type of rebels and misfits that most of the times are tolerated in large organizations rather than empowered and pushed forward. But your question is bigger, right? So your question is all about how can we deal with this sort of uncertainty, and how can we build resilience at the same time that we manage to look beyond what is our business today. In fact, actually, a few seconds ago, I just posted something around how the content delivery business is changing, and this is a type of business that both you and I are dealing with every day, with our podcast, with our conferences, but also, with the way that we are both consulting with our clients, that is becoming, especially in the past months, but who knows, very likely in the next quarter, more and more difficult to meet in person, right? And to have the same type of interaction. So here we are, thinking about new ways of delivering the same sort of value that we were doing before. But at the same time as well, I'm even thinking, is the business we are not going to be completely disrupted in the next, 12 to 24 months? And I'm even thinking, will we have the same type of conferences in 2 years from now, right? And this is where the profile of or the propension to risk sort of kicks in, right? Because at the same time, it's very complicated to build something which is right from the start. You need to build an environment, of trust with you and the clients, where you can start experimenting. And this is no different from the way, for example, you mentioned InnoTribe. This is no different from, almost 12 years ago, Swift did with InnoTribe, right? So it was a sort of an experimenting, and giving space to the startups that back then, nobody cared about. You remember back then, right? An entrepreneur was seen, by the banks the guy in a corner that everyone was laughing about, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is I don't think this is often admitted, but I think that's right. I think if you were a senior person at a bank and you looked at somebody in a startup, you really thought that was a second class citizen, right? If we're being honest, right? That, I guess you couldn't make it in an established organization, so you're working for this really tiny organization. And it took a while to kind of understand it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just completely different. And the ability to build a company focused very tightly around a disruptive idea is so much easier in the startup than it is in the corporate world. And you start to realize it really is kind of a Mars and Venus thing. They're really wired pretty differently. And not very many
Absolutely.
people have been successful in both environments, by the way. Right. And this is a part of
In,
what you talk about in your book.
Indeed, and the book actually sort of was born by a very simple consideration, and is the fact that if you think of the InnoTribe team, at its inception, the Lazaros and myself and the Costa and the Peter Van and the Mariella and the Nectarios and all the names that with all dear friends, none of them is now working at Swift anymore.
Right.
And back then, I thought that we were doing something that, paradoxically speaking, the industry was understanding much better than Swift itself somehow. Because when we were talking to the clients, they were actually accepting the fact that we were exposing some of these new technologies and stuff like that. But as I write in the book, the reason why I left is because I thought that we could have leveraged all these beautiful companies that we were, hitting literally, because they were applying, they were coming to us, right? And the Revolut came to us, and the TransferWise came to us, and the Currency Cloud, and you name it, all this like unicorns or semi-unicorns of today. And I thought that we could have been much smarter, in embracing all this innovation coming in. And then, the rest is history, because of course, I left Swift and became an investor myself. So I sort of tried to catch some of that value in another way. But then I thought bigger than that, and I said, okay, what if this is not an isolated path, and what if there is a type of talent that is naturally inclined to deal with not just doing a little bit better what you do already, but looking at what we're not doing already, and how different businesses can cross path with your current business, and how a completely different type of talent or resource could actually benefit from your business, and vice versa. And so I started collecting stories around the world, and I interviewed a few of our common friends, Neil Cross, for example, to name someone who was clearly,
at DBS in Singapore.
Exactly. So an unusual banker, and now he found his way in something completely different, and from being the best chief innovation officer in Asia into being, in the middle of the jungle with the orangutans, building hotels.
Right.
And yet,
and that's not a euphemism, by the way. He's literally in the jungle in Indonesia, surrounded by orangutans. Yes.
Exactly. Well, now it's of course at the same time, an executive and an investor in a couple of Asian unicorns. So it's
right.
He has still got it, but
right.
still, the lifestyle is completely different. Go.
Should you think this entrepreneur job, right? Putting the rebels inside the organization or the pirates inside the Navy, do you think by definition that's always a temporary job? Because this is so often the story, right? That you come in, you make some change, maybe you have some success, but you always have a certain amount of unmet needs and goals, and you move on. Do you think, can anybody make that long term?
So it's an excellent question, and I think that the only way to make it long enough is if you can use these guys to jump from one intrapreneurship project to another one that is diverse enough, but also motivating enough to keep them in. And I'll give you an example, my very humble, story within Swift. If you remember correctly, if you remember I built something within Swift that was called the swiftcommunity.net, that it was sort of the Facebook of Swift, for lack of a better definition, right? And it was inspired by another social media that is called Italians Online, that was basically putting together Italian expats. I showed that to the, to Lazzaro, that was the Swift CEO back then. And I said, listen, I registered at swiftcommunity.net. I think we should build the same sort of communities for the Swift ecosystem because our website sucks.
And this was when, 2001?
That was 2006.
Six by then. Okay. Still pretty early.
Yeah. I mean, Facebook was just about showing up in Europe back then. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that Swift, that was claiming to advance in the critical dialogue, had a website of like 2 centuries before, like the typical sort of portrait website, one way only, no possibility to interact. And all of a sudden, we got with Swift Community 20,000 bankers in, I don't know how many hundreds of communities, talking about payments and standards and innovation and Rails and you name it, right? Now, 20,000 bankers is not a lot compared with the whole population, but the experiment was right, I think, because it grew exponentially. And a couple of years later, it was sort of embedded in the normal comms of Swift. But then, it was about time to do something else, and that's how InnoTribe was started. And the cycle of InnoTribe lasted sort of 5 years. And to me, the next cycle was, okay, can we turn InnoTribe into the best fintech venture capitalist on earth, right? And it didn't happen, so I left. So that's the story, right? Mm-hmm. But I always ask myself the question, if that sort of collaborative fund would have seen the light back in like 2013, would I have stayed? Probably yes, because everything was there already, right? I didn't care about making more money or be more shiny or whatever. I cared about sort of going to the next into the next stage of what I believed that adventure should have gone, right? And I wasn't the only one thinking of that. So to answer your question, it is extremely complicated to create the perfect the perfect storm over and over again to keep the rebels inside. If it's not the case, it becomes a one-time job or a few months job if you want to. But even like that, it is literally a breath of fresh air for the company, regardless, I think.
Well, and I wonder if part of this is what you said earlier, which is it's one thing to think about the things that you already do and how can we do them better. It's quite another thing to think about the things we're not doing today. It is really hard for an established incumbent to embrace those sorts of things. It's really the rare company that's able to actively do that. And even when you acquire or acqui-hire somebody, you still run into the same thing where, after a couple of years, a lot of times the founder leaves and they don't really get integrated into the organization. And I think, we're talking today about risk and culture, and those are separate yet highly related kind of concepts. And I think that this plays itself out really on both angles. Part of it is about risk and the way established incumbents perceive risk. They often, two things I think. One is they often view risk as binary. Things are either risky or not risky. And secondly, they also conflate risk with familiarity. Right? Things that we know or think we know or have done before don't seem very risky, even though it might be highly risky.
Totally.
Right?
This is a good way of putting it.
And then those things in turn feed the culture, because the culture is, what do we say around here? What do we do around here? What gets rewarded? What gets punished? And then that ends up shaping the culture that really what we reward and encourage is people to just do more of what we've already done because that feels less risky.
Indeed. And, I kind of, I always have I never lose hope that actually giant organizations, and I put everyone in it, right? From banks to GE to the whatever big players in whatever industry. But we are in the financial services one, so let's stick to that for the moment. I sort of lost hope that these guys can change overnight, or that can even change in an acceptable, even close to anything that we know or that we guys outside are used to. At the same time, you get sparkles of change, right? So, for example, even at Swift, actually, I met this guy, is called Quentin, recently, and he has the job to sort of get the Swift people or the Swift leaders smarter. So he's not anymore an HR person. He's a talent and leadership and learning manager. So, and that's part that you can see it even in like large insurances. We have been interviewing actually some of them, into our fintech stages, whether or not is it the digital one, excuse me, or the events that we have done. And you can see that these guys actually are measured into how much novelty and in this case is a riskier part of the culture, right? So it associates risk and culture in this case. They are really measured into how the learning or the new learning of the executives of the company is going to impact the business in the next 12 to 24 months. And as an example, so we are working with a very large Italian bank with Fintech Stage that now has become FTS Group, by the way, because Fintech Stage it relates now to the events, and FTS Group is now like the bigger sort of consultancy arm of the company. Every large organizations or banks, they claim to work well with entrepreneurs and with startups, right? And most of their executives, they have never saw one, right? They never talked to one. They don't know how they think. So we engage in a sort of a simulation whereby we bring these top 70 to 80 managers of the retail bank, and we simulate a startup journey from inception up to capital raise, up to like a business plan presentation, up to sort of being picked or being rejected by the executive of the bank, so that these guys can literally put themselves into the sort of the role of an entrepreneur and share the struggles. Because it is too easy to say that we are in a collaborative mood, in collaborative mood / collaborative mode. But all of a sudden, what you do is that you're kind of looking over the shoulder, these guys that are coming in and never take them seriously, right? Which is possibly the opposite of what you should do.
Well, and we talked earlier about, 10, 12, 15 years ago, there was kind of this prevailing view that if you were a senior executive of a financial institution, you look down on startups as being, maybe not good enough to make it in the corporate world. Now I sense that there's a prevailing view that's unrealistic in a different way. It's, you look at people that leave their bank and, I'm going to go be a startup because it's, I can just focus on having ideas and being wild and taking risk. And, it's not all that either, right? It is taking risk, but you still have to solve a problem that somebody cares about. You still have to figure out how to get somebody else to care about it and buy it from you and how to scale it and all of that. It's just a completely, well, it's what I said earlier. It's not better or worse. It's just completely different. But I think there's been so much glorification of the entrepreneur that it's been romanticized in a way where a lot of corporate executives don't really get the day-to-day struggle either, right? They get that I don't have to wear the tie anymore, but they miss a whole lot of other things.
Absolutely. And actually, JP, that's resumes or paraphrases pretty well. Probably one of the most important messages that I try to convey with the book is that you really don't need to mix up noise with relevance. Sometimes you tend to think that a rebel is just the people or the ones that are making the board noise, or the one are just contrarian by definition. But actually, you need to dig deeper than that, because sometimes this type of attitude is just noise for the company, or useless noise, for a better for lack of a better expression. What you're really looking for is challenging the status quo in a way that brings the company or the business or a new product from a point A to a point B with checkpoints. So it is still doing things with the old-fashioned way. If you want to, for a bank, I mean, you still need to bring results. You still need to prove that you can create something new. You still have to prove that this something new that you're creating, accrues the business, and bring new perspectives. At the same time, the way you achieve it might be through the usage of resources that before were not even considered as such. Statistically speaking, if you are an organization of 20 to 30,000 people, you might have 0.1% or 0.1 to 0.5% of this type of talents, right? And a mistake that we often do is to, I call it, reverse stigmatize them, right? So and put them in a zoo or in a sort of a pedestal or a reverse pedestal because they are rebels, right, JP? So and the last thing you want is to create a zoo done by this wannabe superheroes that you all of a sudden call rebels, because they're not. They are just a type of resource that was hidden or tolerated or sort of neglected so far. And now, if you really want to pay attention to what you're not doing, you have to bring it up. There is no, and actually it is quite simple to understand for incumbents or for companies with the right mindset. And I see that at least if I measure by the way that that companies are intrigued by the subject, I see things are moving towards the right direction.
Well, I think another point that you have brought up in the book and you've talked about before is you have to harness the power of these rebels, because if you don't, they're either going to be subversive within your organization or they're going to leave your organization.
Yeah.
And as we think about, like I said, we're, believe it or not, entering fourth quarter and people are making plans and budgets for the coming year. How should people think about leveraging the talent that they have inside to embrace this risky external environment in a way that can help them move forward and not just kind of hunker down and get through it? But others have said, and I've been saying a lot recently, in times of great change are also times of great opportunity. And so now's the time really to leverage those rebels. What should people do?
So I do think that so it would be too easy to bring back the usual mantra that indeed in a moment of crisis the moment of crisis are the moments where you need to invest the most in innovation, but is again going to be true. Yep. With a little bit, with the extra gist, if you want to, or spicing it up with the fact that this is by definition an unprecedented crisis, and the dimension of that crisis, in several parts of the world is not yet not even measured, but the long tail of that crisis is very difficult to comprehend, because there are measures, for example, in Europe that, for example, as these measures have avoided sort of firing people until the end of the year. So all of a sudden, the 2021 becomes, and you have 1/3 of your workforce in the market looking for a job, right? So, and the consequence of it will actually be seen in 6 to 9 months from now, right? So I think that I don't want to claim that I know what company should do, but certainly something not to neglect is there must be a special sort of look that could be checked or could be diverted into finding this type of talents and matching in a sort of a quick failing series of opportunities to check what is working. And you know what? I'm going to give the best possible example that I know, which is my own company, right? So if you FTS Group, we have been doing events and workshops and podcasts now and the consulting missions and different campaigns, you name it. So now what we are trying to do is I don't think that the clients should be the one bearing the cost of your experimenting to start with. It would be too easy. But what you can do is get the people that trust you best, or the clients that trust you best or the most, sorry, and then start doing a series of experiments and see how the market, or in this case the public, or their clients in this case, would react. And the truth is that in order to do this in a most effective way, again, we are not simply talking about making a conference in person into a virtual one, because that's doing a little bit better in this case towards COVID what we were doing before. Here we're talking about what about doing something that is more maybe audience driven. If I continue the sort of the simulation into our own business, right? So what if we try to make the audience pick what speakers are going to talk about? What if we do live talking so that people will appreciate and differentiate a little bit more the bullshitters from the one who are really bringing real content because they know? Because that if you do live content audience driven, there is not a lot of places to hide, right? So only people that have large shoulders, heavy experience and things to say of value will be able. I also think it's a great opportunity to go back into sort of the ones who really bring value will stay, but they will also need, in our case, to change the delivery mechanism and invent something new. Well, the things that I just said in our micro content delivery business is the same type of reasoning that large organizations or even successful startups are likely to facing up if they want to stay in the business in the next 12 to 24 months.
Yeah, good point. All right, anything else you want to make sure we get in here before the end?
No, I'm really once again really grateful for this. Is actually a topic that we don't talk enough about, because culture is always something that seems like too big to hit, and everyone seems to have an opinion about it, which is legitimate. Right. At the same time, talking, I think that you guys putting this the culture and the appetite and the propensity to risk together is actually an excellent way to bring up something that companies really don't do, right? Because everyone, again, culture is like innovation. No one says we don't innovate. I haven't heard a single company that says we don't like innovation or we don't do anything about it. But the end, and yet what most companies do, as I said, is the incremental one, is not the disruptive one. So incremental innovation is in culture just, be a good company, have good policies, but disrupting innovation to culture is actually go as far as you can into having the courage of disrupting your own business. And this is where the notion of risk is so relevant. So it's actually very, it's very compelling and sort of matching these times, what we just talked about.
Well, Matteo Rizzi, you are a talent and a rebel. You can listen to Matteo on Breaking Banks Europe, and you can pick up his book, Talents and Rebels, Dealing with Corporate Misfits.
Thank you, JP. It was great to be here.
Thanks.
Here with Mary Lemmer, gelato entrepreneur, investor, fintech advisor, leadership and culture coach, and most importantly, professional funny person. Not to put you on the spot, Mary, but say something funny.
Something funny.
Of course you come up with that. Highly regulated industries are not known to be bastions of comedy. Yet here you are, like you've looked at the space, the banking space. You're still a senior advisor to a fintech company. How do you think about comedy in your background, that when we come to cultures that are learning about risk taking, what can we learn from improv?
So much. I mean, improv is all about figuring stuff out as we go and embracing change and embracing uncertainty in a way that is fun and light and listening and communicating with other people. And if we think about companies and companies that are, whether they're highly regulated or not, we're all figuring this out as we go. And we're trying to navigate what's going on now and the changing needs of the team and the company and society. And that's the same kind of stuff we're doing as improvisers, navigating these changing circumstances. So we can kind of use improv as a practice and a metaphor for improving our teams and our company culture.
Well, I do think a lot of banks in particular and regulators as well would rather control the circumstances than adapt to the unknowns. Like they like the known knowns. I'm curious your time in actually, doing professional improv. Do you have any stories of just like saying, no, this is like too risky or too much into the unknown? I have no idea where this is going to end up. And how do you, what's the professional coaching on how you get through that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the principles of improv, the foundational principle of improv is say yes and so this whole idea of yes and is to accept the reality of what's happening. You don't have to agree with it, right? I can be in an improv scene and not agree with what's happening, but I have to acknowledge that it's happening. And so someone might say something I don't agree with, but they did say it. And I think that's and then accepting that, right? Accepting, okay, this was said or this was done, and then taking action. That and part of the yes and is super critical in improv, and also in situations where there's a lot of things where we can't control, right? We can't control so much in our companies, in the global climate, and with competition. But we have to acknowledge the reality that's happening, because that's the only way that we can move forward to either make a choice as to how we're going to move the scene forward, or create a new product or a new marketing campaign, or communicate a new message. Like, that is the information that we need to then move forward and do something. Because if we don't acknowledge that reality of the thing that we can't control, then we're kind of stifling our ability to improvise or create new solutions to innovate or solve problems. We have to acknowledge the problem is there in order to solve it.
I think when put in that context, the idea that it was said, you can't unsay that, especially in front of, the live audience, and pretend that never happened. I don't like where that scene is going. Let's undo that. But off the stage, you don't necessarily need to take action, or you don't always feel like you need to take action. The desire to maybe wait for another word to come out, or another, direction for the scene to go. When you work with companies, how do you go about coaching them in the actually adding the and it to move the scene forward?
Well, I'll tell you this, when we put teams and companies into an improv scene and no one's adding the and, it gets really awkward really quickly because the scene is just stalled. And when you sit there and you feel that, and you're like, oh wow, this is like no one's doing anything, and it's no one's particular job. Like, you can look at the other person in the scene, wait for them to say something, wait for them to do something, and they're also looking at you, waiting to add information. Someone has to be the courageous person to like step forward and add that and to move the scene forward. And so when we experience this in our trainings and the work that we do with teams start to realize that someone, like, both people are in the same position. Both people are trying to figure out, may not know what to say, but something will be said and should be said in order to move the scene forward. It may not be the right thing. There's no right thing. It's just what is said. And by building that trust amongst the people in the improv scene and amongst people in our teams, building that like trust and communication that whatever is said, whatever is done, we're going to be in this together and move this forward, actually allows teams to move forward. And that's why trust in cultures is so important, because that allows teams to move forward and accomplish things at a quicker rate and a more effective rate than they otherwise would.
So how often in that case where things seem to stall, everyone's waiting to say something, if I put on my banker hat, I think everyone turns and looks to the CEO to be the one that's going to lead out of that. Is that the pervasive, of the teams you work with? Is that common? Because I think that also sets up a pretty big trap in terms of not taking accountability for moving things forward. And, the most senior person might not always have the best perspective or the best insight on moving that forward. What can improv teach us around that?
Yeah, I mean, improv is the great equalizer. And so I've been with teams where you've got the CEO, you've got VPs, directors, individual contributors, like all levels of the organization, and everyone's contributing because we play around with status in improv with characters. There's high status characters and low status characters. And typically a CEO is a high status character. And in improv, the actual CEO isn't always playing the high status character. So you get to see that everyone actually has the ability to show up and contribute and make moves and move the scene forward. And it's very empowering for people across the company, including the real CEO, to see and be part of creating something with all people within the company or the team, and recognizing the ability for everyone to contribute and for everyone to recognize their own ability to contribute and how powerful that is. So improv is this way to really get everyone on the same level to experience their capabilities and their power and their ability to contribute all together as a team and to witness that.
So when you get called in to work with a company, and your company is called Improve, nice play on improv, who's normally placing that call that says, what we need here? We need comedians. We need comedic training right now. That in and of itself sounds like it could be a Seinfeld episode.
It can be. Let me tell you. It's. I like to say that we are like giving people M&Ms that are laced with vitamins. Like, they taste good and they're good for you, and that's the magic of and why we're called Improve. It's improv plus the E for effectiveness and have some sort of effect. And typically, the person that calls us is the person that wants something to change or improve. Like, people don't come to us if they want to stay the same. They come to us when they want to change, and they want to change in a way that improves their team and their company. And typically that could be, depending on the size of the company, it could be the CEO, it could be someone on the leadership and development team. We've had directors and VPs of sales call us up because they want to improve their sales. We've had directors of marketing come because they want to improve the creativity within the marketing team. It really is anyone who recognizes that there needs to be an improvement within their team, that they need to have better communication, better sales, better inclusion, better communication, collaboration, any of these things that someone on the team recognizes that's in a leadership position, that those are the people that are calling us.
So how often does it happen that the senior leader that maybe thought it was a good idea and called you in, does it turn out they might be the source of the problem? when you're dealing with some of these cultures?
Usually how much time do we have? The source of the problem, usually if they are the source of the problem, they don't recognize it. If they're there's been teams that people that work for a leader or manager recognize there's a problem, but the manager themselves doesn't recognize that there's an issue until it gets maybe to be a little bit more obvious that there's an issue. And I have countless examples of companies, right, where it's like you put the frog in the lukewarm water and you heat it up and you don't really realize the frog is going to boil until it's boiling. And that happens in companies too. And so typically the person that comes, that calls us isn't always the source of the problem. And I like to say the problem is it's never one individual. And that's one of my kind of beefs about when people say there's a problem with the company or someone in the team, they try to pinpoint it to one person. It's always more complex than that, because it's never linear. It's always pretty spherical. And we have to understand the context of by which this person is operating and the team and the dynamics. And that's what improv reveals, because it reveals how people are behaving. And it brings awareness to each individual, as well as a situational awareness as to what's happening with this team. What are the dynamics that are going on?
And you bring up two important things, but they're slightly contrasting. One is the idea of being observant of the culture and what's going on, and the fact that it could have slowly been heating up. And then there's the opposite, where we're in periods of rapid change and we don't even have time to notice the water. How do you actually share some of the wisdom around when we monitor our culture and whether it's attuned to the right circumstances? What lessons have you learned there?
Well, when we think about companies that are growing at any rate, but particular fast-growing companies, the only other thing that grows that fast is cancer, and cancer kills us. And so if we grow too quickly and without regard for ourselves and our teams, well, that can ultimately lead to our destruction, right? So when we talk about if something grows slowly over time, we don't notice it right away, right? That's the frog in the lukewarm water, and it heats up, and that's oh shoot, we have an issue. That's where we get things like lawsuits, right? Claims against sexual harassment, discrimination. That's where there's actual a very visible cost to these problems that weren't just they were there one day and then the next day there was a lawsuit. Those are things that oftentimes build up over time in some of these cultures. And when we are truly paying attention and communicating with our team and listening, we can start to identify these things before they become that big of a problem, before there's a lawsuit, before there's as much money being spent to handle the kind of crisis aversion of what happens when there's this toxicity that grows over time.
Now, I'm curious when we talk about a mismatch of cultures. So first, can you share a little bit about what Pay It Off does, the fintech that you're an advisory board member to?
Yeah, so Pay It Off is a software company, has got an API that helps people optimize how they're saving money on their student loans. And so they work with financial institutions and fintech companies to power their ability to optimize the borrower's student loan payments, because there's all these different programs out there that allow certain people to defer payments or have different benefits or refinancing, and it's become quite complex. And so they've built a really simple way for financial institutions to really optimize the student loan payments that their borrowers are having to make. And I came out of working at another more well-known fintech company called SoFi, and knew a lot about and had quite a bit of experience working with student loans. And so, and I've known the entrepreneur for a while, and it's really awesome what they're doing and really helping borrowers save a ton of money, but they weren't saving before on their payments.
Well, let's start with the Pay It Off portion of this, because one of the things I find interesting and challenging is, they are a startup. They move fast, although they've, been around a while now. They're not totally green, but they work with a lot of incumbent financial institutions. What do you see kind of the mismatch of the culture? They were invited to the City FinTech Open Innovation Challenge. Do you see, is that one of the problems within these FinTech startup and incumbent partnerships, is that mismatch of culture?
I think it's gotten much more matched than it used to be. I think there's still room to grow where there's obviously here a startup is battling cash flow, right? And getting enough traction with the money that they've raised or the money they have in the bank in the amount of time that they have before they run out of cash. Whereas an incumbent is not necessarily on the same timetable, right? They have processes and approvals and different teams, and it often can take longer than what a startup needs. Culturally, some of those are really around like the speed, right? And the speed of which they need to get things done. And I think that is still a bit of a mismatch that can literally can kill these startups, right? If they don't get results and get the traction that they need in the appropriate amount of time. So 6 months for an incumbent may not seem like that might seem fast, right? To get a deal done in 6 months. For a startup, that is a long time. So that's a mismatch. Yeah.
Now, from your time at SoFi, I'm glad you brought that up, where you were there during, part of the high growth phase, played lots of different roles from business development to operations. What did you learn, and what else would you share around this idea that fast growing, culture, if not being mindful of it, it can kill you like a cancer? When you're in that phase of growth, what are some of the tools you'd recommend that either if you're in that phase or you need to get into that phase, how should you think about keeping your culture effective while growing quickly?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to keep in mind if you're growing that quickly. One is to be collaborative and communicative, right? Like true collaboration involves listening and including people and valuing the people on your team and recognizing that value in a way that's pretty explicit. And I think the experience is that I've had with some of these fast growing companies, including SoFi and others, is that sometimes when you're moving so fast, your priorities can get a little bit cloudy, and to keep remembering people are your greatest priority, like people are your greatest asset. And when you start to forget that and start to treat people as if they aren't your greatest asset, that is a recipe for something you don't want to have, trust me. And something you can do is really to keep valuing people and recognizing people for their achievements. And even, in big ways and little ways, a simple hey, you're doing a great job, or expressing curiosity about what someone's doing versus criticism. The criticism early on, if it's not warranted, and I've seen this happen where leaders on teams that are different from other people's, because they don't understand marketing, they criticize the marketing, and the way in which they ask questions about it has a tone of which devalues that marketing person's responsibilities. And then what happens is that marketing person starts to feel not psychologically safe, not as creative and empowered to take risks, because they don't feel like their job is important, especially if someone with a higher status and a higher title is speaking to them about their role in such a devalued way. So I think the main point to take away there is definitely appreciate people and recognize people for the work that they're doing when you're growing really fast, and don't criticize people if it's not your role. Like if it's not your team, and if it's not something you understand, to criticize that is that's really not fostering inclusive teams and supporting people to do their best job.
You've mentioned safety and trust quite a bit. When you bring up the idea of comedy, oftentimes we think of comedy having, coming at somebody else's expense. And that seems counterintuitive to me that, when we talk about, comedy and something that might be offensive to someone or put someone down, how does that build safety and trust?
How does comedy build that safety and trust?
Yeah.
Well, comedy is really about, in improv in particular, is about collaboration and listening and empathy, right? Because if you and I are in a scene together, there's no script, right? We're having to build this together, which requires us to make eye contact and listen to one another. And we do an exercise in our trainings called first word, last word, where two people have a conversation using the last word someone says as their first word. And what this exercise reveals is that, one, people often are thinking about what they're going to say next while someone else is talking. So they're not actually hearing everything of what someone's saying because they're in their own head worried about what they're going to say next. And the second is oftentimes people are like not listening for meaning. They're like listening for when that person is going to end like what they're saying so that they can say whatever it is they want to get out first. And so this simple exercise reveals the importance of listening fully to what someone has to say, which we need to do in improv because everything that is said is a gift giving information to the scene. If you're saying something and I'm not listening, I'm just waiting for you to stop talking so that I can add the line of dialogue that I want to say, the audience is hearing what you say. And if I don't hear it, but the audience does, and I miss that, and I kind of say no, or I create a different reality, everyone's going to be confused and it's not going to be one of those brilliant, humorous improv scenes that we all love to watch. So if you look at like what makes good improv comedy, what makes it funny, it's really, you can break it down to these core things like listening, communicating, being in the moment, showing compassion, empathy for the other people on stage with you because everyone's watching the same scene, but picking up on different clues, right? Which is the same thing that happens in our teams. Everyone's in the same meeting, but we're all noticing different things about the meeting. And when we begin to appreciate that and celebrate it like we do in improv comedy to create this wonderful scene, when we do that in the meetings, we come up with the best ideas and can solve the problems in the best way and have this diversity of thought and perspective. In order to have that, we need to truly listen to one another and trust one another. And trust comes from listening. And so that's like comedy, improv comedy, humor will come. But if we're trying to be funny, it won't be funny. But when we do these basic foundational things of listening, saying what we see, making observations, trusting one another, and accepting the reality of what is said, funny will come because life is funny. Meetings are funny. Like, we can find the funny in anything, but being real and honest and listening is what's going to actually get us there.
I think we have time for one more. Any other exercises? I like the first word, last word. I was nodding along going, I can see several places I could be applying, that in my own life. But any other lessons or tools you like to use in your training?
Yeah, I think another one that I'll share that anyone can do with their teams as soon as they hear this is one word story. And I put a little spin on it with our trainings called one word pitch. So if you're trying to communicate your idea or a new product idea, or if you're trying to, inspire some sort of change and tell a story to communicate a point, instead of just saying it, do one word story, one word pitch, and basically do it one word at a time. Find a partner. Your partner doesn't even need to know what it is you're pitching, and communicate it one word at a time. So we could do it right now, you and I, Jason, and we could share something one word at a time. Maybe something that we'd like to see happen. You can do the prompt. It's your podcast.
Change.
Okay. So let's do kind of a pitch for something, why we need change or why change is important, one word at a time.
Oh man, this is tough. I thought I got to ask the tough question.
Just start with one word and then we'll keep going.
Justice.
Is
Needed.
Right.
Now.
See?
Yeah.
It's that easy.
That was harder than expected. But that idea of building, I think, on each other, individual words. I love the first word, last word. I think there's a lot to be gained, particularly in cultures that are regulated where, let's face it, a lot of regulation and that anti-risk taking leads to we highly regulate what we share, how we think, how we feel, and what's expressed. And that's probably part of what is holding back the innovation that's so badly needed.
Yes. And when we have constraints, that leads to innovation. And so regulation, boundaries, constraints don't need to be a stifled innovation. And improv really helps us navigate those boundaries and still create something amazing.
Thanks. That has been fantastic, Mary. If people want to learn more about what you do, we'll put up a link to your TED Talk, which is excellent. But where else can they learn about improving their leaders, teams, and companies to provide a bigger impact?
They can check out www.chooseimprove.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being funny and bringing a light heart.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
That's it for this week. If you like the show, make sure to give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform, or share it with a friend, or share it on social media.
We'll see you again next week with more Breaking Banks.